Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I come from an institute that deals with broad human security issues, but I'm going to speak to you a little bit about long-term trends and looking at emerging powers and the changing landscape of natural resource governance. We have had an excellent day yesterday as well as a supper last night, during which much of what I originally wanted to present has, I think, been covered to some degree or another. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the nature of growth in Africa, because this is something that I'm working on, and conclude with some remarks on the future of commodities generally. Now, in the last few days, Ernst & Young came out with their 2013 Africa Attractiveness Report, or quite recently, and it says that the growth opportunities in Africa are increasingly evident. I think we've heard a lot about this. Africa presents a significant opportunity across multiple sectors, with 2.6 trillion of revenue expected by 2020 across resources, agriculture, consumer and infrastructure, of which $1.4 trillion will be in consumer industries alone. The rapid emergence of a middle class already equal in size to China makes consumption a major driver of economic growth across the region, and is one of the most interesting yet less explored opportunities across Africa. And despite perceptions to the contrary, less than 1/3 growth has come from natural resources. That figure has come down from an original ECA estimate that put it at about 53%. According to Ernst & Young, less than 1/3 of Africa's growth has come from natural resources. The rest has come from a range of other sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and in particular, services. If we are to, and this is a figure from Ernst & Young that presents, for sub-Saharan Africa, not Africa as a whole, the contributions to GDP. And the bar on the right-hand side, which is a summary bar, speaks of the average contribution to GDP from 2000 to 2011, and basically makes the argument that natural resource growth is responsible for about 15.9% of Africa's total growth, which is probably the lowest estimate we've seen. As I've said, there have been a various from 53 to 32 to 23, and now one that speaks that natural resources contribution to African GDP growth is only 16%. Now, Paul Collier famously said that Africa is 5 times less explored than any other region in the world. If that is true, we are, in a sense, only from an African perspective, probably at the start of the commodities supercycle seen from the availability of commodities. Work that we've done at the Institute would indicate that Africa's growth is underpinned by 8 factors. The first and most important is that of population growth and urbanization. To the same extent that the growth of North America, Europe, China, India, elsewhere are driven by population growth and urbanization. This is a fundamental factor in the growth of Africa. Second, which we've heard a little bit about, is responsible macroeconomic management and reform. Third, improved agricultural output. We heard something about that with the previous speaker. Relatively stable political frameworks, despite what happened in Central African Republic, despite what happened in Mali. The general trend on internal conflict in Africa is distinctly downward. It will probably remain the second most conflict affected region globally, second only to South Asia, but the conflict trends are down. Relatively stable political frameworks. Instability in the continent has moved generally away from a contestation around control of the capital city through violence to instability on the margins of a number of countries, factionalized armed groups that are no longer fed by the Cold War and armed by external actors, but really have to depend on much smaller pockets of natural sources to fund themselves, criminal networks, etc. More effective aid, targeted debt relief, and increased domestic revenues, the most important factor in driving Africa's growth. Tax revenues are steadily climbing. Development assistance, very important for Africa still, to alleviate poverty, is declining, but it is very important. The impact of the Millennium Development Goals have all pushed for more targeted debt relief and aid. Growth in remittances and foreign investment. And then what we've discussed a lot here is global economic demand from China, but also India, Brazil, and others, and then, of course, the commodities boom. So the Ernst & Young report carries on and says that while investment flows in Africa fell last year, they're still up 13% since 2007. Africa now gets about 5.6% of foreign direct investment. In 2012, South Africa was the largest investor in the rest of Africa, mostly in service industries, although EU and China are larger in value terms, which is helping to reduce the extent to which Africa's growth is dependent on natural sources. And some of you will know the service industries that are being pushed, mostly MTN, Standard Bank, and so on, well-known South African brands. If we are to look at what the trading partners are for Africa in 2011, that's about a picture, and it shows you that brick trade was about 29% with Africa, of which about 20% is China alone. So it is massive. China is massively important for Africa. And literally, if China falters, Africa will face severe challenges going ahead. But the EU as a group remains the largest trade partner as a whole with Africa, responsible for about 37%. Intra-African trade in this 2011 statistic, which is done by Standard Bank, is only responsible for about 9%. Many of you would know, and the point has been made, that trade within Africa is a major challenge. A large portion of that trade, in actual fact, consists of oil that is transshipped from Nigeria to, amongst others, Ghana and other countries for them to refine. So intra-African trade is in actual fact very, very low. This is the lowest estimate that I've seen. The other one is about up to 12%. But the focus on infrastructure, very, very necessary. We've seen tremendous growth in trade in Africa. China-Africa trade has grown by about 1,510% from 2001 to 2011. It was about 200 billion, you've heard the figure before, in 2012, compared to about 116 billion in 2011. So it is growing at a compound and an absolutely amazing level. I've mentioned, while intra-African trade is very low, it is growing quite fast. US-Africa trade has grown about 225% over the same 10-year period. EU-Africa trade is growing by about 190% over the same period. And if we look at the exports from Africa, despite the growth in the services and the manufacturing industry, this is also a figure from Standard Bank, we can see that minerals, pearls, precious stones, ore, slag and ash, copper and other, these are the main things still that the continent exports, which is the reason for the push towards the transformation of Africa, the push that particularly the UNECA is now leading on towards the beneficiation, the transformation of our commodities exports to benefit Africans. It is why we find the focus on so-called resource nationalism, etc., across the continent. Africans are going to insist that companies invest in beneficiation, in support of the conversion of our raw material to move up the value chain. I'm going to conclude with a few figures just to give some idea of where things seem to be going. This, again, a figure from a graph from Ernst & Young, just pointing to Africa's economic output and a forecast until 2017 in terms of African growth in the years that lie ahead. This is in US in $1 billion. Now, the critical thing that I think we must understand what is driving this, that is a figure from the International Forecasting System model that shows a global growth from, in this case, 1960 with a forecast to 2040. The world economy at the moment is about $55.4 trillion. It's the size of the world economy. In 10 years' time, if all things by the so-called base case forecast, that is going to be about $75 trillion. That is about $20 trillion more than it is today. The issues that are driving this, and the countries that are driving global growth, and it's evident from this forecast with regard to the sources of global growth, is really, you can see the US steady increase in wealth, but look at the rise of China and of Brazil. These countries, their future determines not only the future of the demand for commodities, but the future of wealth and prosperity globally. And behind that lies the amazing changes in population that we are seeing in Africa and globally. This is a graph that shows the working age population from 15 to 65 years of age. And you can see in that graph what's happening in the EU at the bottom. But what you see is that by 2032, Africa will have a larger working age population than China, and by 2036 than India. That population growth globally, but in particular in Africa, is the major factor in driving African and global development. I'm not going to speak really about GDP, purchasing power parity, and where this is moving, but the summary is in the graph, which tells you that China overtakes the EU and the US by 2024. GDP per person is growing. It was around it was about $900 per person in Africa by 2010, and by 2030 it will be about double that. And that is despite a population increase of about 500 million people. I'm not really going to speak about this, but just to make the point that Africa's growth, you all know that northern and southern Africa is much more wealthy than the rest of the continent, and will continue to be so, and that Central Africa remains the region most challenged. This is a graph that shows the global population. It shows population distribution in 2030 of India, China, the US, and Africa. And I put it up because it gives you a visual, never mind the colors which show you how much of the population is forecast to be to have received no education, primary, secondary, tertiary education. But look at the configuration of the graph of Africa, the population momentum, which is immense. I always make the point that by 2050, 23% of the world will be African, which means 1 in every 4 person in the world is a Nigerian, and it always gets people's attention. And this is the result of all of this is I can't see, but I assume my time is finished. Yeah. Okay. 1 minute. Okay. All of this is driving global demand. This is just a forecast of energy demand. I think this is, if I'm correct, is a billion barrels of oil energy equivalent. It's a global forecast. This is a graph that may seem a bit complicated, but it's a forecast of energy production, history and forecast, And the curve that you see that refers to other renewables, of course, is not other renewables. It basically includes shale and other energy production types, which is not yet included in this forecast. But that issue, the shale gas revolution, is going to have a global impact on literally on everything. And if you look at for example, what BP says, it says that 93% of energy consumption growth is in non-OECD countries, accounting for 65% of world consumption by 2030. The US, as we know, is going to become an energy exporter. And the impact on Africa is that its demand for West African crude is falling through the floor. Now, China and others are taking that up because the energy demand continues to exceed supply, and despite the shale gas revolution, that will happen. Now, what happens? At the moment, nobody believes that China can ramp up its shale gas to the same extent as the US, but China has done amazing things. And it is not impossible to speculate that China becomes a net energy exporter, which would moderate global energy prices, which would increase energy consumption and therefore carbon emissions, and have exactly the reverse impact that many of us think. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I've tried to give you is to give you a very short snapshot of the main factors that are driving both Africa's growth and the demand for the commodities supercycle. Yes, the commodity supercycle may ebb and flow in the immediate future, but if you look at those population and growth figures, I think the future is fairly clear. And the future is only one way, in my view, and that is upward. The implications of all of this for the sustainability of the planet and for sustainable development is an entirely different issue. But our analysis is that by about 2030, certainly in Africa, growth projections are going to start to bump into the climate change and growth are going to start together. And the result will be that already fast levels of urbanization on the continent will intensify. And this is going to present many other challenges for the stability of the African continent with regard to the challenge of managing urban areas, which is really our main security feature. Thank you very much.